All right, let's go. Number 10. The golden spike and the execution that took 60,000 years. In the low green hills of Zhejiang province in eastern China, there is a quarry called Meishan. It does not look like the most important place on Earth for understanding death. It looks like a roadside, cutting in soft gray limestone, the kind of outcrop a geologist might drive past without slowing. But across the 1990s and 2000s, a series of expeditions came to this exact slope to measure something that had never been measured with precision before the moment the world nearly ended. The man who pinned it down was Samuel Bowring, a geochronologist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, working with the Chinese paleontologist Shen Shuzhong of Nanjing, and a younger researcher named Seth Burgess. Their tool was uranium lead dating of zircon crystals, microscopic grains locked inside volcanic ash beds that had settled across the seafloor 252 million years ago. Zircon traps uranium when it forms and rejects lead, so the lead it contains today is a clock ticking at a rate we understand to extraordinary precision. In 2014, in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the team published their result. The Great Extinction at the end of the Permian had occurred 251.9 million years ago, and the main pulse of dying the interval in which the overwhelming majority of species vanished had lasted less than 60,000 years. 60,000 years sounds like a long time. It is not. Against the 4 billion year history of life, it is a single frame of film. It is shorter than the span that separates us from the last Neanderthals. Our own species has existed for roughly 5 times that long. The entire architecture of the living world, built and elaborated across hundreds of millions of years, was dismantled in a window narrower than the recorded memory of humanity stretched 5 times over. But here's where the precision becomes disturbing, rather than reassuring. For most of the 20th century, the End-Permian Extinction was imagined as a slow decline, a gradual fading, a world growing tired across millions of years. The new dates erased that comfort. This was not a fading. This was a collapse so abrupt that by geological standards, it is effectively instantaneous. Something happened, and then very quickly, almost everything was dead. And that changes the kind of cause we are forced to look for. Slow declines can have slow, diffuse explanations. A 60,000-year annihilation demands a single catastrophic engine, something violent enough to overwhelm the entire planet's capacity to absorb a shock. The Meishan dates did not solve the mystery of the Great Dying. They sharpened it into a knife. They told us that whatever killed the Permian world did so with a speed that should not have been possible, and they handed the next generation of scientists a question that has not been fully answered to this day. What could move that fast and kill on that scale, and leave a planet so thoroughly emptied that it would take millions of years to refill? The golden spike at Meishan is now marked with a small monument, a quiet plaque on a quiet hillside that almost no one visits. It commemorates the boundary between 2 worlds, the world before and the world after. Standing on it, you are standing on the thinnest line in the entire fossil record. Below your feet, an ocean teeming with life. Above it, silence. And the distance between the two, measured in rock, is no thicker than your hand. Number 9. The reefs that turn to stone, and the 96%. In the arid mountains of West Texas, the Guadalupe Range rises out of the desert like the spine of something enormous and dead. It is in a sense exactly that. The geologist who spent decades reading these rocks, and many like them around the world, was Douglas Irwin of the Smithsonian Institution, whose 2006 book on the End-Permian carried a subtitle that did not exaggerate how life on Earth nearly ended. The Guadalupe Mountains are the fossilized remains of a Permian reef. The Capitan Reef, a structure that once fringed a warm tropical sea, built by sponges and algae and corals over millions of patient years. Reefs are the cathedrals of the ocean. They are also the first things to fall. When researchers tally the losses of the End-Permian event, the numbers reach a magnitude with no parallel in the rest of the fossil record. Estimates first advanced by the paleontologist David Raup and refined by decades of fieldwork since suggest that as many as 90 to 96% of all marine species disappeared. Trilobites, which had crawled across the seafloor for nearly 300 million years and survived every previous catastrophe, were gone. The great Paleozoic corals, the rugose and tabulate corals that had built the seas for 250 million years gone. Entire classes of life that had defined the oceans since before there were forests on land simply stopped. To grasp 96% invert it. Out of every 100 species, swimming, crawling, filtering, and drifting through the Permian seas, 4 made it through. 96 did not. Apply that ratio to a modern city of 1 million people, and you are left with 40,000 survivors in an empty world. And then there are the reefs themselves. After the extinction, the reef-building organisms vanished so completely that for several million years into the Triassic, the planet had essentially no reefs at all. Geologists call it the reef gap. The cathedrals were not merely damaged. They were abandoned, and no one came to rebuild them for longer than the time that separates us from the first stone tools. Here's where the marine record stops behaving the way extinctions are supposed to. Extinctions are normally selective. A changing world favors some forms of life and punishes others, and the survivors are usually the ones with some clear advantage mobility tolerance a particular diet. The End-Permian Extinction was not selective in this way. It cut across nearly every branch of marine life, at once sparing no group on the basis of any obvious adaptation. Filter feeders died beside active predators. Shallow water dwellers died beside the creatures of the deep. The pattern of the killing did not match the pattern of a normal ecological pressure. It matched the pattern of a planet whose basic chemistry had been broken. This is the reason the Great Dying occupies a category of its own. The other great extinctions of the fossil record, including the asteroid that ended the dinosaurs, were severe. None of them came close to this. The End-Permian is the only event in the history of complex life where the entire system, ocean and land together, came within a few percentage points of total collapse. Irwin titled his book The Way He Did for a reason. This was the closest life on this planet has ever come to ending altogether. And the survivors did not survive because they were the fittest. Many of them survived, as far as we can tell, because they were lucky. The Capitan Reef still stands in the Texas desert, dry and silent. Every coral and sponge inside it turned to stone. You can walk along what was once a living wall on the edge of a vanished sea. The animals that built it are not extinct in the ordinary sense the way a single species fades. They are extinct as an entire world is extinct. What you are looking at is not a graveyard. It is the fossil of an apocalypse, and one of the few that left enough behind for us to read. Number 8. The Siberian Wound and the Rivers of Fire that Would Not Stop. In the remote heart of northern Russia, across a frozen expanse larger than most countries, there is a layer of dark volcanic rock that geologists call the Siberian Traps, from the old Swedish word for stairs, because the basalt weathers into vast stepped terraces. For more than a century, these rocks were a curiosity. Then, as the timing of the End-Permian Extinction was nailed down, their significance became impossible to ignore. They are the scar left by the largest volcanic event the planet has experienced since complex life began, and they erupted at almost exactly the moment the world died. The work of dating them precisely fell to geochronologists, including Seth Burgess and Samuel Bowring, whose results appeared in Science Advances in 2015 and in Nature Communications afterward. Their conclusion was stark. The Siberian eruptions began before the extinction, but the most intense phase, and crucially the phase when magma was forcing its way sideways through the surrounding rock, as underground sheets called sills coincided with the moment life collapsed. This was not an ordinary volcano. It was a flood basalt province, not a mountain that erupts and subsides, but a continent-sized wound in the crust through which lava poured for hundreds of thousands of years. The numbers strain comprehension. Estimates of the total volume of erupted and intruded magma run into the millions of cubic kilometers, by some reconstructions as much as 4 million. The lava and ash once covered an area of perhaps 7 million square kilometers, a region roughly the size of the continental United States, or the whole of Australia, buried under rock in places hundreds of meters thick. Run it in the present tense for a moment. The ground splits along fissures hundreds of kilometers long. Lava rises and keeps rising, and it does not stop, not for a year, not for a lifetime, not for 1,000 lifetimes. This was not an eruption in the sense we usually use the word. It was the planet bleeding from a wound that would not close. But here's where sheer volume stops being the point. Lava itself, however enormous, is a local problem. You can outrun a lava flow. What you cannot outrun is what comes out of the ground with it, and out of these eruptions came an atmosphere's worth of poison. Carbon dioxide by the trillions of tons. Sulfur dioxide that would have fallen as acid rain across the hemisphere. The eruptions did not kill by fire. They killed by changing the air and the sea of the entire planet, and they did it for so long that the Earth's natural machinery for absorbing such shocks was simply overwhelmed. This is the engine. Almost everything else in the catastrophe, the warming, the acidification, the loss of oxygen in the oceans, the poisoning the heat cascades downstream from this single source. And the most sobering aspect of the discovery is how ordinary the trigger was in geological terms. The Earth has produced flood basalts before and since. Several of them line up in the rock record with other mass extinctions. The mechanism that nearly ended life was not an exotic visitor from space or some unrepeatable cosmic accident. It was the planet's own interior doing something the planet's own interior does on a scale that happened to cross a threshold from which there was almost no return. Today, the Siberian Traps weather quietly into their dark staircases beneath the Arctic sky, drilled by mining companies for the nickel and palladium the eruptions left behind. The people who work those mines are extracting wealth from the single largest act of destruction since animals first appeared. They stand on the cause of the great dying every day, and the rock gives no sign of what it did. No warning, no mark of conscience, only stare upon stare of cooled black stone, climbing toward a horizon that 252 million years ago was on fire. Number 7. The buried fuel and the planet that set itself alight. In 2009, a team of geologists led by Henrik Svensson at the University of Oslo published a study that reframed how the Siberian eruptions killed. Svensson and his colleagues had been examining not the lava itself, but what lay beneath it. The eruptions had punched up through the Tunguska Basin, a vast sedimentary basin in Siberia, and that basin was not empty rock. It was loaded across thousands of meters of strata, with coal, with petroleum, with organic rich shale, and with thick beds of salt and other evaporates. The magma did not simply erupt over this material. It intruded into it, cooked it, and ignited it. The work published in the journal Earth and Planetary Science Letters identified the smoking guns, directly thousands of pipe-like structures. Breccia pipes blasted vertically through the Siberian sediments, the throats of explosions where superheated gas had torn its way to the surface. When magma intrudes coal and petroleum, the result is not lava. It is a chemical factory operating at apocalyptic scale, generating carbon dioxide methane, and a witch's brew of halogenated compounds, methyl chloride, methyl bromide gases, that do not merely warm a planet. They strip away its ozone and poison its air. Svensson's estimate was that the Siberian intrusions could have released carbon on the order of tens of thousands of gigatons, vented explosively through those pipes into the atmosphere. Set that beside the present. All of human industry, burning coal and oil and gas for 2 centuries has released a few thousand gigatons of carbon. The Siberian Traps, by these estimates, may have released several times that much, not from refineries and power plants, but by accident, by magma, blundering into the buried fuel of an ancient world and lighting it. The Earth, in a sense, burned its own fossil fuels. It just did so by force in the dark beneath a continent all at once. And here is where the story turns from geology into a warning written in stone. The fingerprint of all that carbon is preserved as a sudden violent shift in the ratio of carbon isotopes, a steep negative excursion that appears at the extinction boundary in sediments all over the world. It is one of the most reliably recorded signals of the entire event. And it tells us that an enormous quantity of isotopically light carbon, the kind that comes from once living matter, from coal and oil and biological methane, was injected into the atmosphere and ocean in a geological instant. The carbon cycle did not drift. It convulsed. The implication is one that researchers working on the End-Permian rarely state casually, because of how directly it speaks to the present. The Great Dying was at its core a crisis of carbon. It is the planet's most extreme demonstration of what happens when an immense reservoir of fossil carbon is liberated into the atmosphere faster than the Earth's systems can absorb it. The source was different volcanoes intruding coal rather than humans extracting it, but the chemistry is the same chemistry. The ocean acidifies. The world heats. The oxygen falls. And the record shows with terrible clarity where that road ends when it is followed far enough. We are today releasing carbon faster than the Siberian Traps did. Not as much, not yet, but faster. Svensson's breccia pipes stand empty now, the throats of the moment. The Earth set itself alight from the inside the chimneys of the largest furnace the planet has ever lit, and the carbon they vented is no longer in the rock. It cycled through the air and the oceans and the bodies of the dying, and then across millions of years, the world slowly drew it back down and buried it again. The planet healed itself eventually. It simply did so on a timescale that has nothing to do with us, and over the graves of nearly everything that had been alive. Number 6, the acid in the water, and the shells that began to dissolve. In 2015, a team led by Matthew Clarkson, then at the University of Edinburgh, published a study in the journal Science that did something the field had long wanted, but struggled to achieve. It measured directly the chemistry of the dying ocean. Clarkson and his colleagues had traveled to the United Arab Emirates to sequences of rock that had once been the floor of the Permian Sea, and there they sampled the boron locked inside the ancient sediments. Boron isotopes are a proxy for the acidity of seawater. The pH of the ocean leaves a chemical signature in the rock, and the signature Clarkson recovered was alarming. The data revealed that the End-Permian Ocean acidified, and that it did so in distinct pulses. As the Siberian carbon flooded into the atmosphere, a great deal of it dissolved into the sea, where carbon dioxide and water combined to form carbonic acid. The ocean's chemistry tipped. Its pH dropped. And for organisms that build their shells and skeletons out of calcium carbonate corals, certain plankton-shelled creatures of every kind, acidifying water is not an inconvenience. It is a slow dissolution of the very material their bodies are made from. The Clarkson study concluded that one of these acidification pulses in the final phase of the extinction was severe enough to be a direct killer of marine life. To understand what that means, start with the buffer. The ocean is the planet's great chemical buffer, a body of water so vast it can absorb staggering insults and barely register them. There are roughly 1.3 billion cubic kilometers of seawater on this planet. To shift the chemistry of all of it measurably toward acid requires an input of carbon so enormous that the number ceases to mean anything. And yet, the rocks say it happened. The buffer was overwhelmed. The largest chemical reservoir on the surface of the Earth was pushed past its limit, and the creatures that depended on its stability paid for it with their skeletons. Here's where the chemistry conceals something the numbers alone do not show. The organisms most vulnerable to acidifying seas are not random. They are the calcifiers, the reef builders, the shell makers, the architects of marine ecosystems. These are the foundations. When they go, everything that lived among them, fed on them, and the sheltered in their structures goes with them. Acidification does not kill a species. It pulls out the floor beneath an entire community, and the collapse propagates upward through every level that stood upon it. And here the rocks reach forward into our own time in a way few researchers can ignore. Ocean acidification is not a hypothetical concern of the deep past. It is happening now measurably in our own seas, driven by the same fundamental process: carbon dioxide dissolving into water and lowering its pH. The End-Permian is the most extreme example in the entire geological record of where that process leads when it is pushed to its limit. It is the worst case file. Clarkson and his colleagues were not merely reconstructing an ancient death. They were reading the only complete record we possess of what a fully acidified ocean does to the life inside it. And the answer the rocks gave was that it kills on a scale that nearly ended the living world. The boron in those Emirati rocks holds the chemistry of a sea that vanished 252 million years ago. Water that turned for a geological moment corrosive enough to dissolve the creatures swimming in it. We can read its acidity now with instruments precise enough to recover a number from a vanished sea. What we cannot do is unsee what that number means. The ocean has a limit. The Great Dying is the proof that the limit exists and the measure of what waits on the other side of it. Number 5, the poison seas and the breath of hydrogen sulfide. In 2005, 2 studies appeared within the same period that together described one of the most frightening aspects of the Great Dying. One led by Cleety Grice at Curtin University in Australia and published in Science reported the discovery of a particular molecular fossil in End-Permian rocks, isoreneurethane, a biomarker left behind by green sulfur bacteria. The other by Lee Kump of Pennsylvania State University and his colleagues took that finding and followed it to its terrible conclusion. Together, they described an ocean that had not merely lost its oxygen. It had become a generator of poison. Green sulfur bacteria are organisms of a very specific and very sinister habitat. They photosynthesize, but they do not use water. They use hydrogen sulfide, and they can only live where that compound reaches up into the sunlit surface waters of the ocean. Their molecular fossils in End-Permian rocks mean that the deadly chemistry of the deep sea had risen all the way to the surface. The oceans had become anoxic starved of oxygen, and worse euxinic, saturated with hydrogen sulfide, the gas that smells of rotten eggs and kills animal life at concentrations measured in parts per million. Kump's hypothesis, published in the journal Geology, was that this poisoned water did not stay in the sea. Where hydrogen sulfide built up to sufficient levels, it would have bubbled out of the ocean and into the air. Hydrogen sulfide is lethal to a human being at around 700 parts per million, a concentration that kills within moments. The reconstructed End-Permian oceans, in Kump's analysis, may have belched this gas into the atmosphere in quantities vast enough to poison life on land, as well as in the water, and to attack the ozone layer from below, even as the volcanic halocarbons attacked it from within. The reconstruction is of an ocean not blue, but stained in places the milky turquoise and green of sulfur bacteria and toxic chemistry, releasing a stench of decay across a dying world. This is not a metaphor. It is drawn from the molecules left in the rock. But here's where the poisoned ocean model resolves something the other explanations struggle with. Volcanic warming and acidification can account for much of the marine death. They have a harder time explaining why the land died so thoroughly at the same time, why forests collapsed, why terrestrial vertebrates were culled by 70%, why the killing reached so far inland. Hydrogen sulfide venting from a global ocean offers a bridge. A poison that rises from the sea and spreads through the atmosphere does not respect the coastline. It kills the fish and then it kills the things on the shore, and then it kills the things in the forest, and it does so with the same breath. What makes this particularly unsettling is that the conditions that produced it are not as remote as we would like. Oceans lose oxygen when they warm because warm water holds less of it, and when their circulation slows, and when they are flooded with nutrients. All three of those things happened in the End-Permian, driven by the Siberian carbon, and all three are processes that operate in the oceans today. There are already regions of the modern sea, dead zones, where oxygen has collapsed and the water has begun to generate hydrogen sulfide. They are small. They are localized, but they are the same chemistry in miniature that the End-Permian ran across an entire planet. The poison seas were not an alien condition. They were the ordinary chemistry of a warming, stagnating ocean, scaled up until it became a weapon. The molecules of those sulfur bacteria survive as faint, chemical ghosts organisms that bloomed in a sea turned against everything else alive. They are the signature of an ocean that did not merely fail to support life. It manufactured the means of life's destruction. For a stretch of time, we measure, in the millions of years, the largest body of water on Earth exhaled poison, and the world breathed it in, and there was nowhere on the surface of the planet that the breath of the dying ocean could not reach. Number 4. The lethal heat and the dead zone at the equator. In 2012, a study published in Science delivered a finding so extreme that the researchers built it directly into the title of the paper, Lethally Hot Temperatures. The lead author was Yadong Sun, working between the University of Leeds in England and the China University of Geosciences in Wuhan, with a team that had spent years collecting a very particular kind of fossil from the rocks of South China. The fossils were conodonts, tiny tooth-like remains of an extinct eel-shaped animal, and locked inside their phosphate was a chemical thermometer that recorded the temperature of the sea in which they had lived and died. The thermometer was the ratio of oxygen isotopes, which varies with the temperature of the water. Sun and his colleagues measured it across thousands of specimens, spanning the End-Permian and into the early Triassic, and the temperatures they recovered were extreme. In the aftermath of the extinction, the surface waters of the equatorial ocean had reached around 40 degrees Celsius over 100 Fahrenheit. Sea surface temperatures that high are not merely uncomfortable. They exceed the limit at which most complex marine animals can survive. Photosynthesis in marine plants begins to fail. Animal metabolisms collapse. The equatorial belt of the planet, normally the most biologically productive zone on Earth, became, in Sun's phrase, a dead zone, a band around the middle of the world, too hot to inhabit. To feel the weight of 40 degrees set it against today. The warmest tropical seas, now the ones that bleach and kill coral reefs when they spike for a few weeks, sit around 29 or 30 degrees. The End-Permian equatorial ocean was 10 degrees hotter than that, and it stayed that way not for weeks, but for an extended interval of the early Triassic. Fish are thought to have fled the tropics entirely, surviving only at higher latitudes, nearer the poles, where the water was merely hostile rather than fatal. The middle of the planet, the warm heart of the living world, was abandoned. Life retreated toward the cold ends of the earth and waited. But here's where the heat reveals the deepest cruelty of the great dying, its refusal to end. The extinction is often imagined as a single blow, a catastrophe, and then recovery. The temperature record says otherwise. The lethal heat persisted for millions of years into the Triassic, long after the worst of the eruptions had passed. The planet had been pushed into a hothouse state so extreme and so stable that it would not let go. Life did not get to begin rebuilding the moment the killing stopped. The killing did not stop. It softened into a long, grinding planet-wide fever that suppressed recovery and kept the world barren across a span longer than the entire history of the primates. This is the part that connects most directly and most uncomfortably to the questions we ask about our own future. The End-Permian demonstrates that a planet's climate has states, and that if you push it hard enough, it can flip into a new state and stay there indifferent to whether the force that pushed it is still present. The Earth is not a spring that bounces back the instant you release it. It is a system with thresholds, and on the far side of those thresholds lie conditions that can persist for geological ages. Sun's conodonts are a record of the Earth, held in one of those states, a hothouse so severe the equator became uninhabitable, and a reminder that the climate's capacity to flip and lock is not a theory. It is written in the teeth of animals that died in water hot enough to kill them. In the chemistry of fossils smaller than a grain of rice, the rocks of South China preserve a sea that reached 40 degrees and held there while the world emptied. The animals that left those fossils did not survive what they recorded. They are the thermometers of their own deaths. And the temperature they measured is one the surface of this planet has not seen since, and one we would do almost anything to ensure it never sees again. Number 3. The broken sky and the forests that stopped growing. In 2018, a researcher named Jeffrey Benka, then at the University of California, Berkeley, ran an experiment that sounds at first like it has nothing to do with a 252 million year old extinction. He took living pine trees and exposed them to elevated ultraviolet radiation, the kind that would reach the surface if the ozone layer failed. Then he looked at their pollen. And the pollen came out deformed, misshapen, unable to function in a way that matched with eerie precision the malformed spores and pollen grains that paleontologists had been finding in End-Permian rocks for decades. Benka's study, published in Science Advances, proposed that the broken pollen of the deep past was the fingerprint of a sky that had come apart. The idea had been building for years. The Siberian eruptions, as Henrik Svensson had shown, released not only carbon, but halogenated gases, the same class of compounds that opened the hole in our own ozone layer before they were banned. Hydrogen sulfide, rising from the poisoned oceans, would have attacked the ozone from the other direction. The End-Permian sky, by this reconstruction, lost its shield. Ultraviolet radiation that the ozone layer normally absorbs would have poured down onto a world with no protection, sterilizing plants, damaging the reproductive machinery of forests, and leaving its mark in deformed pollen scattered through the rock. Benka's malformed grains were the laboratory confirmation of a planet standing unprotected beneath its own sun, and the land bears another even starker signature of what happened to it. In End-Permian rocks across the world, at the precise boundary, there is a sudden global surge in a single type of microfossil Reduvia sporanites, interpreted by the paleontologist Henk Vischer and his colleagues as the remains of fungi, a fungal spike, an explosion of decomposers feeding on the dead at the exact moment the forests fell. And after it, a phenomenon geologists call the coal gap. For millions of years, into the Triassic, almost no coal forms anywhere on Earth, because coal forms from accumulated plant matter, and for millions of years there were not enough thriving forests to make it. The trees did not just die, they stopped coming back. What makes the land record so difficult is how directly it confronts the limits of what we know. The fungal interpretation of the spike is debated. Some researchers argue those microfossils are algal rather than fungal, and the precise cause and severity of the ozone collapse remain an area of active investigation rather than settled fact. The mainstream caution is reasonable, and it should be stated plainly, and yet the caution does not dissolve the mystery. It deepens it. Because whatever the spike was, it appears at the boundary worldwide, in lockstep with the death of the forests. Whatever broke the pollen, it broke it on a global scale. The disagreement is about mechanism. The fact of a planet-wide collapse of terrestrial plant life, leaving fungi or algae to inherit a world of corpses, is not in dispute. The forests of an entire planet were gone, and the rocks recorded their absence for longer than mammals have existed. Set the whole scene side by side. The ocean is acidifying and losing its oxygen and exhaling poison and heating toward 40 degrees. And above it on land, the sky itself has failed. The protective layer stripped away ultraviolet light, pouring down onto forests that are dying and not regrowing, while fungi bloom across the rotting remains of a vanished green world. There was in this interval very nearly nowhere left to live. Not the tropics too hot. Not the open ocean too poisoned. Not the deep sea anoxic. Not the land beneath an open sky. The Great Dying did not attack life from one direction. It closed every exit at once. Grain after microscopic grain, the malformed pollen records plants, trying to reproduce beneath a sun, they were no longer shielded from the last efforts of forests that would not survive. And the coal gap layered above them is an absence you can hold in your hand, rock after rock, where the buried remains of thriving forests should be and are not. The silence in the fossil record has a thickness. You can measure in stone exactly how long the world went without its forests. The number is longer than everything our kind has ever done. Number 2, the microbe that may have helped end the world. In 2014, a team at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, led by the geophysicist Daniel Rothman, published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that offered one of the strangest and most disquieting twists in the entire investigation of the Great Dying. Rothman and his colleagues had been troubled by a detail in the carbon record. The way the isotopes shifted suggested an input of carbon that was not just enormous, but accelerating, growing faster over time in a way that pure volcanism struggled to explain. The answer they proposed was not geological. It was biological. A microbe, they suggested, may have helped tip the world into catastrophe. The microbe is Methanosarcina, a single-celled methane-producing organism, an archaeon, that lives in oxygen-free environments and turns organic matter into methane gas. Rothman's team, working with microbiologists, found genetic evidence that around the time of the end, Permian Methanosarcina acquired a new metabolic ability, a pathway transferred from another microbe that let it consume acetate, a common product of decaying organic matter, far more efficiently than before. With this new capacity, and with a planet's worth of organic matter accumulating in the disrupted oceans, the organism had the means to bloom on a global scale. The one thing it needed was a nutrient nickel, a trace metal essential to the enzymes involved. And the Siberian Traps, as it happens, are one of the richest sources of nickel on the planet. The eruptions in this model did not only poison the world directly, they fertilized the microbe that would help finish the job. Follow the chain of cause this implies. A continent-sized volcanic eruption supplies nickel to the oceans. A microscopic organism, having recently gained a new gene, uses that nickel to bloom across the sea, converting the dead matter of a dying world into methane, a greenhouse gas, and a fuel for the carbon catastrophe in quantities great enough to register in the global isotope record 252 million years later. The worst extinction complex life has ever suffered may have been driven in part not only by the planet's interior, but by the smallest and simplest form of life feeding on the consequences. The microbe and the volcano working together against everything else. And here is where intellectual honesty matters, because this is the most contested entry on this list. The Methanosarcina hypothesis is not the consensus explanation for the End-Permian carbon shift. Many researchers favor the volcanic and buried carbon sources as sufficient on their own, and the genetic dating that underpins Rothman's timeline carries real uncertainty. The mainstream skepticism is reasonable, and it should be stated plainly. And yet the hypothesis has not been refuted, and it persists in the literature for a reason. It accounts for features of the carbon record that the simpler explanations handle less well, and it draws on independent lines of evidence from genetics, geochemistry, and the unusual abundance of nickel at the boundary. The case is not closed. the microbe remains a suspect. And whether or not it is ultimately vindicated, the hypothesis carries an implication that lingers long after the technical debate fades. It suggests that the line between the living world and its own destruction is thinner than we imagine. That life is not only the victim of planetary catastrophe, but can, under the wrong conditions, become a participant in it. A single gene transferred between two microbes in an anoxic sea may have nudged the planet further down the road to ruin. The biosphere is not only fragile, it is under sufficient stress capable of turning against itself, of manufacturing the very conditions that erase it. That is a far more unsettling idea than a volcano. A volcano is indifferent. A biosphere that can help kill itself is something else. We will probably never know for certain how large a role the microbe played, if any. Its bloom, if it happened, left only the faintest of traces, a shift in the chemistry of the rock, a pattern in the genes of its descendants, still living today in the mud of oxygen-starved places. But the possibility alone changes how we see the Great Dying. It may not have been a simple story of the Earth attacking life. It may have been a story of life pushed past some invisible threshold, helping to attack itself, and of how little it took in the end to set that in motion. Number 1, the survivors, and the reason you are here to hear this. In the rocks of the Karoo Basin in South Africa, in layers laid down during the first chaotic ages after the world nearly ended, the fossils of one animal appear again and again in numbers that drown out everything else. It is called Lystrosaurus, a squat, barrel-bodied, beaked creature about the size of a pig, with 2 tusks and a face built for digging and rooting through hard ground. Paleontologists, including Roger Smith of the Isiko South African Museum in Cape Town, have spent decades documenting the Karoo's Permo-Triassic rocks, tracing how the rich, varied vertebrate communities of the late Permian collapse into the impoverished assemblages of the early Triassic, where by some counts, this single animal accounts for the overwhelming majority of land vertebrate fossils. The world had been emptied, and into the emptiness walked Lystrosaurus. Lystrosaurus was a therapsid, a member of the lineage once called the mammal-like reptiles, the branch of the tree of life that runs toward the cynodonts, and from the cynodonts to the first true mammals, and from them eventually to us. Lystrosaurus itself was a dicynodont, a cousin on that branch, rather than a direct grandparent. But it did not travel through the bottleneck alone. Among the survivors of the Karoo were small cynodonts, as well burrowing animals like Thernaxodon, already carrying features that would one day come to define mammals. The synapsid lineage our lineage passed through the narrowest gate complex life has ever found, and the depleted caste that carried it forward included the direct ancestors of every mammal that has ever lived. Hold the scale of this in your mind. As many as 96% of marine species gone. 70% of land vertebrates gone. Whole branches of the tree of life pruned away forever. The trilobites, the great Paleozoic corals, entire orders that had endured for hundreds of millions of years. And through all of it, through the heat, and the poison, and the broken sky, and the dead seas, a thin thread of survivors carried forward the lineage that would 252 million years later produce a creature able to dig up the rocks, measure the isotopes, and reconstruct the whole terrible story. You exist because that thread did not break. If it had, if those few stubborn survivors had failed, none of it would follow. Not you, not this, not a single thing our species has ever done. But here's where the Great Dying stops being ancient history and becomes something closer to a mirror. Everything that nearly ended the world at the close of the Permian was at its root a carbon catastrophe, an immense release of carbon into the atmosphere, and the oceans faster than the planet could absorb it. We are running a version of the same experiment now. The source is different. We extract the buried carbon deliberately, rather than igniting it with magma, but the chemistry does not care about the source. The ocean acidifies by the same reaction. The world warms by the same physics. None of this is a prophecy. The Siberian Traps released more carbon than we are capable of across many thousands of years, and we are not facing the end of complex life. But the End-Permian is the only time that carbon system was ever pushed to its absolute limit, and what it produced is the worst event the living world has ever endured. 252 million years ago, the world died, and a handful of small, stubborn creatures carried life across the gap to the other side. One of those threads, an unbroken chain of ancestors, not one of whom failed to reproduce, leads directly to you in a body built by the lineage that survived the Great Dying. Every person who has ever lived, every language ever spoken, every monument ever raised, descends from the few forms that made it through. The margin was almost nothing. The world has emptied itself before and refilled, and it did not do it for us. We are not the point of the story. We are the part of it that is awake for now reading a warning the rocks have been holding for 250 million years. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.